Yes, he is.
Yes.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming this morning. So I'm going to present my graduate research topic that I did for my thesis, the effects of physical geographic features in video games. I would like to thank my major professor, Dr. Shiketti, and all of my committee members for helping me out and reading it over on such short notice. But let's go ahead and get right into it. All right, so before we get fully into it, here's just a quick overview of this project. So this thesis aims to examine the effects that physical geographic features and temporal aspects have on individuals when interacting with video game environments. So video game environments meaning just video games in like particular, not excluding anything, just including the landscapes, the different features, the world, everything. So to get this information for my research, I used surveys to help understand what physical geographic features and how temporal aspects affect individuals' immersions in a video game environment. And to conduct these surveys, I used ArcGIS Survey 123. The 4 video game environments that I used for participants to interact with before completing the survey are Genshin Impact, which can be played on PC, console, and mobile devices. Guild Wars 2, which is on PC, Fortnite Battle Royale, which is on PC, console, and mobile devices, and Mandagon, which is on PC and mobile devices. I made sure that all of these video games were free and had many different types of devices that they could play on in order to make it more available to everyone. And also I made sure that all of these environments had good use of geographic features. I also examined literature in geography, video games, and video game geography to place this study of video game geography in the larger field of geographic literature because video game geography is a currently new but filling gap in geographic literature, and I aim to do my part to help fill that gap. Also, physical geographic features that participants are familiar with also seem to provide a sense of place and to individuals and increase their immersion. Temporal aspects such as distances being too long or too short between point A and point B also affect their immersion. And once we get into the data analysis, we'll be able to see that. So first, let's get into the introduction. So why did I choose video game geography? So video game geography is a gap, which is, as I've done more and more research, is currently being more and more filled in geographic literature. And it is very important research to conduct because video games are a very increasing or in popularity medium. So more and more people are interacting with video games, doing things with them, and it is important to know how the geography within them affects people for us as geographers. So also my personal experience with video games and how immersed I feel in them. I've played video games since I was like before I could even read, probably like 3 or 4. And immersion is important in video games because feeling immersed in any medium, whether it be literature, movies, books, it's important to understand what affects individuals and how it affects them. So in this case, I'm looking at how the geography affects them. And lastly, the availability of people who regularly feel or play video games and feel immersed within them is a very large group of people and continuously increasing as video games increase in popularity. So here are the objectives that I aim to complete with my research. So first, I want to observe the physical geographic elements that affect an individual's perception of a video game environment. So I want to understand essentially what types of geography affect their immersion, whether it be places that they're familiar with, places that they're not familiar with. I want to know how those link to their perception. My second objective is to provide video game environments that make good use of physical geography to survey the participants to interact with. So, as I said before in my overview, I gave them 4 different environments, Genshin Impact, Guild Wars, Fortnite Battle Royale, and Mandagon. In my survey analysis, no one actually picked Mandagon, so I don't have any survey results for that, sadly, even though it's a really beautiful and immersive game. Let me go over a bit about the geographies of the specific video game environments, and I'll keep it pretty brief. Genshin Impact has a very diverse landscape and cityscape. A lot of the cities, towns, and villages within them are based on different periods in times. So like some of them are Renaissance era, which have Renaissance architecture. Some of the background music is Renaissance-esque in its sound. We have some castles based on like medieval castles in Europe and villages surrounding the castles. We also have traditional Asian villages. They are based in Japan, I believe. Actually, no, China. Because that is where the video game was originally created. It was created by a Chinese publisher, and so a lot of the towns and villages have traditional Chinese architecture. For Guild Wars 2, it's the most different out of all my environments, I believe, because Guild Wars 2 geography and landscapes are there to primarily tell a narrative. It's there to supplement the story of the game, and there's not really much focus on it as a whole. So some of the environments in Guild Wars 2, Guild Wars 2 has a lot of areas, so I'll keep it pretty brief. It has mountainous areas, villages, ravines, swamps, other standard geographic locations that many people are familiar with. Though these locations are primarily filled with like enemies or NPCs for players to interact with, sometimes fauna and animals, but primarily the geography is there to help tell the narrative. Fortnite Battle Royale, it has the most modern landscapes, and its geography is extremely diverse. I would say that in real world distance, the map is probably around 50 miles by 50 miles, around that. And in this short or small area, they provide many diverse landscapes and cityscapes, a lot of them being suburban areas, urban areas, metropolis, and also just little village areas. So a lot of people might feel immersed in those landscapes because it is the most similar to what we see today. The landscapes are also very diverse because there are rocky mountains, glacial mountains, there's swamps, grasslands, hilly areas, just everything that a lot of people would be familiar with seeing, no matter where they're from. And our last landscape is Mandagon. And it's the most different out of all of them because the first three are first person 3D, or not first person, but 3D video game environments where the players have a full range of 3D movement. Mandagon is a 2D platformer, meaning that players are limited to up, down, left, and right. However, the geography used in Mandagon is portrayed really well for it just being a 2D environment. Its locations are very diverse. You travel from a cave area to a mountainous area, then up to a castle-like area. So similar areas to some of our other video game environments, but just beautifully portrayed in a 2D landscape. And my third objective is to understand how temporal aspects of video games affect an individual's immersion. Because sometimes distances from point A to point B being too long might break an individual's immersion. Because if it's too much like the real world, let's say if we're traveling from Jacksonville to Birmingham in a video game, players won't want to sit there for 45 minutes to an hour just to get to point A to point B. That would ruin their immersion. The inverse can also be said because if the distances are too short, then the players will not have enough environmental stimuli like the landscapes, the fauna, the plant life, and so on and so forth to interact with and see to help build up their immersion. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the literature review. So the literature on video game geography is new and requires a literature review on geographic theories in the real world to help better understand the role of geography in video games. Two major themes that I primarily focused on about how geographic features affect individuals' immersion in video games are mental maps and affect in geography. The the implementation of the materials and studies collected from high impact geographic journals and video game journals and books. So I took a lot of different things, not only from the video game geography literature that I found, but also from geographic theories from our real world to help better understand how geography affects people within video games. So first, let's get into mental maps. So geographers have been aware of mental maps since around the 1960s when Kevin Lynch released the image of the cities. And then in 1974 when Peter Gould and Rodney White published mental maps. So when it comes to mental maps, they are not simply representations of real places. Mental maps are non-visual representations of the environment. mental mapping in video games can impact people's real-world mental mapping, and also when immersing oneself in video game environments, positive memories are usually made depending on the game. So this fact is solidified in Manassian's study, where creating mental maps, participants remembered positive memories that they experienced within games. One of their participants recalled playing The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and was telling about how they got stuck in a certain dungeon area, and it took them a extremely long time to figure out that they needed to light a stick on fire in order to light a torch to open up a door. And they said that once they figured that out, they were extremely happy and went on to tell their entire family over dinner. And still, whenever The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time is brought up, it brings back that specific memory of that location, and they bring back positive emotions from that. And next, I'll get into geography and affect. Affect plays a really big role in understanding how people get immersed in video game environments. So, in recent years, the emotional impact of video games has skyrocketed as virtual environments have become more lifelike. Literature on games has kind of failed to capture this dimension, and they kind of imply that the player is an incorporeal being ignorant of their virtual landscapes. However, that's not entirely true. The virtual landscapes do have an impact on the player and their immersion and their emotions. So, how does one use affect in video games? So, Thrift says that using his affect programming theory, that emotions can better be understood in video games, and this includes amazement, fright, rage, disdain, and melancholy. We use the term affect to refer to our precognitive, unconscious, and embodied reactions to visual input. So, not just physical input, as in reacting to something that's here with us in the real world, visual input as well, such as looking at a screen at a video game and the landscapes in there affecting us. So as long as video games have featured virtual worlds, they have had an emotional impact that has transcended emotion or representations on screen. Modern three-dimensional games increasingly feature emotionally charged environments and situations for players to interact with. And so not just the settings being emotionally charged, but the environments as well, such as the landscapes. Many scientists have also been investigating the link between cyberspace and human health. Merleau-Ponty maintains that, or says that, physicality is essential for existence. Being able to connect with their surroundings, participate in certain activities regularly, and that is all made possible by having a body. So that means when it comes to our surroundings, our bodies are the only objects that can simultaneously be it, the thing that the surroundings affect, and I, being ourselves. All right. So now that we have some core geographic theories that I use, let's get into our methodology. Right here is a map of the participants that I've collected in the survey. We have one in Minnesota, around 26 in Alabama, one in Georgia, and one in Florida. The majority of the participants are from Alabama due to the advertisement of the survey primarily being on our campus, Jacksonville State University. And I believe that these other participants that are farther away are most likely either, for the case of Georgia, people going home and completing the survey, or for the southern part of Florida and central Minnesota, people sharing this survey with their peers. All right, so let's get into the methods. I touched on them briefly before, but I provided participants with environments for them to interact with, and then a short survey for them to complete. So participants would interact with an environment of their choosing. I made sure to make the genres and platforms diverse to help people um, pick genres that they are most familiar with or like more. That way they can be more immersed in the environment. And then they complete a short survey on ArcGIS Survey 123 to provide feedback about how the geographic features and temporal aspects of that environment affected them. Next, I go through and analyze the quantitative and qualitative data that the survey provided me and made charts for the quantitative data and then compared the charts with the qualitative data. I also did archival research. I reviewed past and current literature on video games, geography, and the geography of video games to help better understand what immerses individuals in the environments. And lastly, I used some online mapping techniques using ArcGIS Online, ArcGIS Pro, and data collected from ArcGIS Survey 123 to create some topographic maps to help with analysis. All right, so now that we know the methods used, let's go ahead and get into the survey data analysis. Here are the demographics of the survey. I know we only have a few minutes left, so I'll keep this section brief. We have a majority of the people being male, white, ages 18 to 24. Our other ages are 25 to 34 and 35 plus. We have less people of Hispanic or Latino or Spanish origin or Black or African American people, and a less diverse spread of ages and gender as well. And due to the area that this survey was released, I don't see that these results are odd because it was primarily released on our campus in Jacksonville State University, and it was primarily advertised to classes that some of the faculty have sent out the survey to, and primarily gaming clubs here on campus. So now that we know the demographics, let's get into how immersed our participants felt within the video games. So the first graph up on top shows the landscape's impact on participants. I asked my participants to rank on a scale from 1 being poor to 10 being excellent on how the video game environment impacted their immersion. So the diversity of the landscape, including not limited to the topography, vegetation, and fauna, allows players to fully immerse themselves in the world due to similar characteristics in the real world. So I hypothesize that the physical features play a significant role in a player's immersion in video game environments, and the top graph shows or how they, or sorry, the bottom graph shows how immersed they felt in the environment, meaning the video game overall, to further accredit this hypothesis. So to get that data, I asked how they felt immersed in the environment overall. This question had a similar plot to the one above, meaning that there is some correlation with immersion in the landscape and immersion in the video game as a whole. And to help better understand why this is, let's get into the next set of questions I asked my participants about their familiarity with the environment. So in the first graph, I asked the question of, were participants familiar with the landscape to better understand if a sense of place was created in the real world and could be transferred over into the video game world? And if so, if the familiar landscape affected their immersion. From the response to this question, the majority of people were familiar with the landscapes that they were exposed to within the video game environments. So the provided environments are all fictional worlds and do not share any real locations with the real world. But they do have things in common, like physical geographic features, diverse landscapes, vegetation, fauna, and so on and so forth. In the upper right graph, I asked, do you think that being familiar with the landscape affected your immersion? And for the bottom right graph, I asked, do you think experiencing a new landscape affected your immersion? The results for both of these figures were very similar, and that leads me to believe, since there's a correlation between the two, and due to some qualitative answers that I got, being familiar and experiencing new landscapes do affect people in video game environments, and they sometimes affect people in different ways. To paraphrase some responses, some people said that being familiar with different landscapes from where they were helped immerse themselves in the environment. Some people said that being familiar with the landscapes made the game feel a little mundane and reduced their immersion. Some people said when experiencing new landscapes that being not familiar with it actually decreased their immersion because they couldn't relate it to the real world. And some people also said the inverse, that experiencing a new landscape, in fact, did boost their immersion because they were wanting to explore and understand this new landscape. And next, temporality, a little bit over time, so I'll get through this a little fast. In the first graph, it shows how players enjoyed their travels within the game. The majority of people ranked it over 5, so above average. Most everyone enjoyed traveling within a video game. The next two graphs ask if shorter or longer travel times would boost their immersion. For the top graph, I have about a 50-50 split of people that think both decreasing the travel time or keeping it the same would boost their immersion. And in the bottom graph, the majority of people say that longer travel times would not burst their immersion, but would hinder it in video games. So that being said, video games nowadays are pretty much created to be as streamlined as possible. So they keep travel time at a perfect level to not hinder an individual's immersion. So even though some people can't agree that shorter travel times would or would not affect their immersion, most everyone would agree that longer travel times would detriment their immersion. And I decided to include just one of the topography analyses I did. This one being the one we're most familiar with, Jacksonville State University. So for the topographic map, I created that using a hillshade raster and satellite imagery to examine the topography of the participants' surrounding area. So as you can see in Jacksonville, we have our semi-urban area, Chocoloco Mountain, and some hilly and forested areas close by. So players familiar with this landscape would most likely feel immersed in a semi-urban setting. Games with forests, mountains may influence their immersion due to their close proximity to Jacksonville. And also to note that some participants might not actually be from Jacksonville. This is just the area that Survey 123 collected when participants completed the survey. And one participant who played Genshin Impact responded that their immersion was not negatively impacted when playing, but it actually helped because the world's laws are already not based on real world things. So seeing a new landscape felt like seeing a new place in real life. A participant that played Fortnite Battle Royale said that the multiple distinct biomes in games like Fortnite are a big selling point because exposure to various landscapes mixes things up and allows you to keep engaged in the game while not being disruptive enough to break immersion. Sadly, not many participants answered why or why not to if being familiar with the landscape did hinder their immersion besides the graph. And most people said that it did not. But I believe that with our geographic features surrounding us, being able to link things we are familiar with to these new landscapes did in fact boost players' immersion. So, in conclusion, I find that these results are extremely interesting and that there is a correlation between immersion and the use of geographic landscapes in video game environments. Geographic theories that we use in the real world can be applied in video games to help better understand those environments and how they affect individuals. And as for the temporal geography of video games, from the survey results, most participants agree on one thing. If travel time is too long, it will negatively affect their immersion. And some participants say the inverse can also be true, as if the distance is too short, they won't have enough time to fully experience the landscapes of the video game, and that would hinder the building of their immersion. So, in conclusion, there is a definite link between the geography of video games and how players are able to immerse themselves, and the temporal aspects of video games and how they immerse themselves. So for future research, I would like to create a new survey with more quantitative questions because it seemed for the qualitative questions, a lot of the participants didn't really fill them out fully or just put NA in there. So the most I had to go for were some really good qualitative answers and a lot of quantitative. So to make up for the missing of qualitative answers in the survey, I'm going to consider using interviews by adding a question in the survey. Would you like to participate in an interview sometime after this survey, and then let them drop down their email to get in contact with them. I would also like to review literary geography articles and journals more because with literature and video games both being forms of media that people are able to be immersed in, I believe that there are some parallels that can be drawn between the two. And I would also like to investigate more on sense of place in video games. Thank you for everyone for coming and listening to my thesis presentation. Any questions? I think that in Fortnite, the changing of geography somehow does not negatively affect people's immersion, because I think that, as some participants have said, experiencing new environments did in fact increase their immersion. So keeping it new and fresh with Fortnite updating its areas regularly does positively affect how immersed they feel there, because it's sometimes a new adventure every update in the game. Thank you, Miles.
Dexter, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Cicchetti.
I have a question for you. What is your favorite game out of the ones that you chose to use in your research study, and why? And what is your immersion with it?
Oh, could you repeat the last part?
Oh, kind of how is your immersional experience with that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Basically, if you were to answer this survey for one of your games, what would that answer look like?
Right. So my favorite game is ironically the one that no one interacted with, Mandagon. It's just a very beautiful and abstract game that only takes like 40 minutes to fully complete. How my immersion was within the game, I believe I was pretty immersed in the game, because I said it took like 40 minutes for it to beat, but it felt like I was playing the game for a way shorter time. I was very compelled to place myself within the game's world, even though it's just a little box man jumping from platform to platform in different diverse environments like caves, mountains, and castles.
Thank you.
No problem. James asks, how do I think my results might change when adding AAA games like Elder Scrolls or Elden Ring in the study? Let's see. I I personally believe that due to the AAA nature, the um, companies that are based in creating video games, that they have the proper training and, of course, funding and time to make these games as perfect as they possibly can. And so the immersion in these games would possibly be better than some of the indie games. Not saying for all indie games, because I have been very immersed in a lot of indie games. But for AAA titles, I would like to believe that with their funds and time and many developers that they have, that they would be able to boost immersion more than your standard indie game.
Dexter, I have a question for you.
Yes.
Why do you think that race and ethnicity is an important factor in your assessment and in your in the interview you did?
I believe that they are important factors because in other game studies, which I reviewed but did not put in my full thesis, which is why I kind of cut race and gender out of my literature review to focus more on mental maps and effect. But some studies showed that race and gender do sometimes have a correlation with what video game genres you're more immersed in. For example, the African American or Black community, they are more likely to be more immersed in fighting games, or I believe in the study they also said, to a lesser degree, sports games, and even to a lesser degree than that, shooter games, whereas people with Asian descent are typically more immersed in video games that have more of a narrative. And from the top of my head, that is all I can remember from that study, but there are definite parallels to be drawn between ethnicity and the types of environments that people are immersed with. And as for gender, that's more of a statistical demographic that I wanted to view to understand. I know that female identifying and gender non-conforming people are starting more and more to play video games, and as video games have been more of a male identifying media in the past. And I just wanted to see, in possibly a better spread survey than this one, how those statistics hold true.
Thanks.
No problem.
I think at this point we're gonna close the defense portion and questions. Thanks everyone for coming and joining us. And at the moment now, the committee's going to convene, and I'm actually going to ask Dexter just to hang out for a little bit, and I'm going to hopefully put you in a breakout room here.
Mm-hmm.
And,
thanks everyone for coming.
let's see. All right. Oh, we have a little bit to discuss? Anybody have any thoughts? Want to
Well,
go
first, I think you might want to stop recording.
Oh, that's true. Thanks, Daniel.